Good evening, everyone, in Science and Values. What I want to do is discuss this coming week's reading, the reading for the week of November 2nd through November 6th. And this reading is going to be we're kind of moving away from thinking about the pandemic to an extent. We spent, about the last month or so, and it's come up in various contexts, but I really kind of had designated those last 3 weeks specifically for thinking about the pandemic. But this week's readings don't explicitly deal with that as much. We're still in the Elliot text, but we're shifting gears. We're moving into a different chapter of the text, and it's dealing with chapter 2. And the title for that chapter is "What Should We Study?" That is the title for that chapter. And in order to kind of understand what's going on in this chapter, I just want to briefly back up and just remind you of the major argument of Elliot's book. So Kevin Elliot is trying to figure out how we can tell when the interaction between science and values is appropriate or not. And one of the ways he suggests, so if you remember going back to the beginning of the book, he suggests that the way that values can properly be incorporated into science is if the value influences are made transparent. Also, if the value influences are, if scientists are engaging with the public, with each other, it could be other audiences that they're engaging with, but if a scientist feels as though a value is influencing the way that they're thinking about a problem or studying a problem, then they need to engage with other individuals to try and figure out if it's an appropriate. And if they engage, through that process of engagement, they are able to figure out a way that they can incorporate that value into the study appropriately, then the value influence would be considered appropriate. So anyways, I'm just trying to remind you of this sort of bigger framework for Elliot's book. And there's a third criterion that Elliot gives us in that opening chapter, if you recall from several weeks back. Elliot says that that value influences are appropriate in science to the extent that what scientists are studying should be, it's slightly different than transparency and engagement. It's a slightly different way of thinking about it's a criterion, but it's not exactly the same as transparency and engagement. Because what Elliot is saying is that the things that scientists study and the things that get funded should be representative of what Elliot calls larger social priorities. And if you recall when we discussed this in class, I kind of presented this as a potentially problematic way of thinking about, or I presented it as potentially the most controversial of controversial part of Elliot's argument, which is he is saying that what scientists study and what science gets funded, to repeat what I just said, should be representative of major social priorities. And of course, I think the question that arose during that class was, I think the immediate question rises is, well, how do we know what a major social priority is? How do we figure out what that is? Is it going to be obvious what major social priorities are? In saying that science needs to be representative of larger social priorities, are we in some ways making science beholden to politics? And we're saying, because maybe the way that we figure out what the social priorities are is through thinking about the political process. So for example, major social priorities are the big ideas and values that are being advocated by those who happen to be in political power at the time. Now, it doesn't have to be that, but I think there is at least a legitimate concern with Elliot's argument that we're left just asking, how do we determine what a society's major social priorities are. One of the ways that we might respond to that is through the political process. And if we're trying to figure out what the major social priorities are through the political process, then there's a concern about science, that somehow scientists are needing to respond to what the ruling party in power in politics has kind of decided are the country's major social priorities, or something along those lines. And some might see this as interfering with what we might consider, or what we might want to be, the independence of science from too much political influence. Now, that's not the only way that we can, determine major social priorities. We can just, we can just have conversations. We can have philosophical conversations. We can have, basic conversations with each other about what the major social priorities are. And we could argue that that's what science should be. That's what scientists should be studying. That's what scientists should and shouldn't be studying. If the things they're studying, so anyways, I think there are going to be some obvious examples. So it's not as controversial as it seems. I think there are going to be instances where it is controversial, but not every instance is going to be controversial. And you're going to see an instance that I don't think is all that controversial that comes up in chapter 1 of Elliot's book, or chapter 2 that I'm going to be talking about now. So again, the title is chapter "What Should We Study?" And Elliot begins the chapter by describing an incident. I wouldn't say an incident. It's a speech that somebody named Larry Summers gave. Larry Summers used to be I don't think he still is. He was the president of Harvard. Larry Summers has served in various presidential administrations. He served in the Obama administration. He served in the Clinton administration. He is a very influential academic, politician, advisor, etc. And he's known, he is a Democrat, a liberal. So he's largely served in Democratic administrations. And Elliot recalls this incident where Larry Summers is giving this speech about, sort of female empowerment. And at a certain point in the speech, Summers references how it is that females tend to be, underrepresented in science, and he's trying to give an explanation as to why girls and women are not he's trying to give an explanation or think about the reasons why females might not be motivated to go into science. And he gives some reasons, but one of the things he ends up mentioning is he talks about intelligence studies. And he sort of mentions this, and he ends up being part of his speech, and he gets criticized a lot for this. And I think the audience was kind of taken aback, and they were a little bit surprised that somebody like Larry Summers would want to offer this as some kind of explanation for why girls are not, not going into science or into, STEM related fields. Why girls are not pursuing those kinds of things. And, bringing up intelligence studies seems like an odd choice. It's not as though that is not offered as an explanation. I mean, I have heard this myself before, even in a field like philosophy, for example. Philosophy among the academy, I mean, science might be bad, but philosophy is actually one of the worst in terms of the academy, in terms of having female and especially minority representation. It may be the worst. It may be the whitest, male discipline in the academy. So that is one thing to say, but but some people there. I've heard this explanation before. I have heard people simply say, "Well, if girls were interested in philosophy, then they would go into it. Maybe they're just not interested in it, and maybe there's kind of a thing there too, and some might say, well, if they were smart enough to go into the philosophy, then they would, but maybe their brains work differently or something like that." So you could see that as an explanation being offered, and I've heard it offered before, sort of in passing, from people who want to offer this explanation, rather than wanting to think about maybe some structural barriers that might prevent girls or females from going into certain disciplines. They want to just kind of offer the what seems to be maybe the simplest explanation, but also potentially the least convincing, which is that, well, if they wanted to, they would. And maybe if their brains work differently, they would. And, so I've heard this kind of thing offered, and to hear, somebody like Larry Summers in this speech, in this prominent forum, he's the president of Harvard, he's giving this speech, to hear him mention intelligence studies, I think it struck people as surprising. And what is mentioned by Elliot now kind of pivots into his. Remember, his framework here is he is saying that what scientists study should be representative of major social priorities. And so he kind of uses this example of Summers as a way to sort of ask this question. Should we, for example, be encouraging scientists, or should we be funding science that is proposing to study whether there is a genetic basis for intelligence between men and women? Should we be encouraging scientists to study that, and should we be funding those things? And Elliot, in this chapter, is offering an argument that no, we shouldn't be encouraging that, because he wants to say that this is not something that is representative of a major social priority, and in fact he thinks that studying and funding genetic bases for intelligence, in fact, it directly opposes a major social priority that he thinks we have, which is gender equality. And gender equality simply meaning that we should be striving to have, in various aspects of human life, whether that be in employment, whether that be in education, whether that just be in the sort of cultural and social attitudes that people have towards women. But that generally speaking, he thinks that a major social priority that a country like the United States has and should have is gender equality. And he thinks that intelligence studies, asking whether there is a genetic basis for intelligence, will only exacerbate the existing biases and prejudices that individuals have towards women. And he doesn't. So he sort of, his argument seems to be that these things don't need to be studied because they will only exacerbate and make worse a social problem that already exists. And if you think, especially in the context of something like the Me Too era, Elliot wrote this book, I think, in 2017, and I don't remember precisely when Me Too kind of emerged as this cultural and social phenomenon. But if you think especially about our present context, it's kind of hard to understand why we would be encouraging scientists to study these things. And I mean, I'm not here at the moment, I'm not necessarily saying I agree with Elliot's position, but there is some intuitive appeal of Elliot saying that this should not be something that is a major priority that we should be studying and funding, because it would exacerbate existing social problems, and potentially it would further discourage young girls or women from going into STEM fields. It would only further encourage that, or discourage them from going into STEM fields. And so he says, why would we want to do that? Of all the things we could study, of all the things we could fund when it comes to science, there's so much. Why this? And Elliot's response is that there doesn't seem to be a compelling reason to study this. And Elliot goes into not only the history of intelligence studies of men and women, but also thinking about intelligence studies when it comes to the races. he points out that there is a long history of biological racism, for example, of scientists who were using science to justify their political agenda, to try to show that African Americans, for example, were somehow inferior to whites. And there were various ways that they would try to do this by, looking at the structure of their skulls and the structure of their brains and trying to show that, in fact, there is a genetic basis to show that blacks are actually inferior to whites and things along those lines. So there are a number of kind of problems with this. In this one in particular, he's saying, look, there's a long history of using science to try and serve these potentially problematic social and political goals of maintaining a kind of a privilege. And so he's worried about that as well in the context of studying whether there's a genetic basis for intelligence between men and women. So according to Elliot, there's just not a good reason to study this in the first place or to fund it. So let's say somebody does study it. Well, then if they do study it, well, if they apply for a grant, it just shouldn't be funded, right? So that's his argument, is that according to his criterion of representativeness, studying a genetic basis for intelligence is not representative of a major social priority, and therefore should not be studied and should not be funded. That's his argument, and I think it's fairly straightforward. There's another part of this chapter that I just want to talk about briefly, and it comes in the later part of the chapter. And I have, if you take a look at the syllabus, I'm asking you to read pages 32 to 37, and this deals with private funding of science. When it's not when scientists are applying for grants from the NIH, for example, or from the NSF. It's not when scientists are applying for publicly available, taxpayer funded grants. It's now he's talking about privately funded science. And Elliot here wants to think again about this question of representativeness, and whether in the case of privately funded science, we could make a case that that private industry, in particular biomedical technology companies, whether we should demand of them that the things that they study and the projects that they fund should be representative of larger social priorities. And I think it's a bit more tricky in this case, because we might say that private biomedical technology companies have fundamentally an economic interest in studying and funding projects that are going to make money for them. That's straightforward. So there's this underlying economic motive for private science or private technology. And so to ask whether they should be studying things that are representative of larger social priorities, but that also wouldn't make them money, well, the question is, should we be doing that? Or is it reasonable to demand of them that they engage in those kinds of things, given that they are private and that major social priorities interfere with these companies' ability to be profitable? So that's kind of the tension between them there. And Elliot mentions the example of studying malaria in underdeveloped parts of the world. And Elliot goes through some pretty staggering statistics about how, malaria was kind of wiped clean from, developed countries long ago, like the United States. But in countries like Africa, malaria is still a very big problem amongst the local populations there. And Elliot is asking whether, these biotech companies should be investing in malaria drugs to help the poor populations of the world. And this is a harder question because, again, they are private companies and they are going to want to invest in things that are profitable for them. And so is it reasonable to ask them to invest more money in malaria drugs, for example, when, for example, the individuals that will be given these drugs actually won't be able to pay for them? So what's in it for the company to do this, other than the kind of altruistic, criterion that Elliot's giving, is that, companies should be investing in major social priorities. And we could agree that eradicating a disease like malaria, it should be a major. And so at this point, we're not just talking about a social priority of a country like the United States. Now we're talking about a global priority. Eradicating disease is a major global social priority. And so should we be insisting and demanding that companies invest more in this kind of research if it isn't profitable for them? Or maybe the question could be, and maybe you guys could speak to this better than I could, how could we incentivize or make it profitable for companies to invest in this kind of research and this kind of, in these kinds of drugs? That could, so maybe that's a better question. If we could make it profitable for them, or if we could incentivize them, how might we do so? So that's actually all I have for this week. This is a rather short video, but I just wanted to talk through two of the examples that are given in the reading. And overall, it's just dealing with this Elliot's question and criterion of representativeness.